Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is March 26th, 2024, and let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So, I want to have my final closing statements in regards to this terrorist attack that occurred on Friday in Moscow. And I think that the more time has went by, the more I think that the scenario number two of Russians getting caught with their pants down is the likely scenario that occurred here. Again, I'm not saying that the false flag what isn't a scenario that is probable. I think that this is also a potential scenario, but the more I look at this, I think that the Russians were absolutely caught by surprise, even though they were warned. Again, today we have more statements from Putin's little minions. That is Bortnikov, the FSB chief, and also Patrushev that came out essentially saying the same stuff, that they're suggesting that Britain, the United States, and Ukraine could have been behind and involved behind this terrorist attack, which is absolutely ridiculous. And there's no evidence whatsoever being presented by the Russian authorities, which is another very telling thing. Now, why do I think that the Russians were caught with their pants down? Number one, we know, based on what happened on Friday, that it took over an hour, 17 minutes for the Russian security forces to be present and actually show up. And when they showed up, they looked completely disorganized, lost, and it was chaotic. They didn't know what to do. And I think the very most telling evidence is the fact that if it was a false flag attack, the Russians would have already forged documents and evidence that this was directly tied to a Ukrainian operation, right? Passports, documents, license plates, bodies. They would have already prepared that much more in advance, right? And they didn't. And they still can't find evidence from Ukraine. It took over a day for Putin as well to address the nation in regards to this terrorist attack. And most state media channels continue to air their shows like nothing happened during the first few hours of the terrorist attack when it was unfolding, and they kind of pretended nothing was going on. And also, we need to also understand that most of the Russian security forces have their hands tied in Ukraine. They're all working on Ukraine right now, whether it be FSB, Rosgvardia, etc., other institutions, security institutions in Russia. They, I think, completely missed this one, even though they were warned in advance by the United States, Britain, and other intelligence services. So I think that the very fact that the Russians are desperately trying to pin this on Ukraine without providing any conclusive evidence whatsoever, just saying it out of thin air, basically creating these narratives out of thin air without any evidence, really suggests, in my opinion, that this was just Russia being basically caught by surprise, and they're a complete loser when it comes down to internal security. And they're artificially trying to just find a Ukrainian connection. Now they're saying that the attackers, the four attackers that we have seen a few days ago that were presented to the courts, all beat up, tortured. One of them seemed like he was unconscious on a wheelchair. That really shows you yet again what Ruski Mir is all about. Right, not saying that if they were indeed the perpetrators, that they deserve to be treated, fairly or anything. But there is such a thing as, having some sort of humanity, and the Russians yet again have absolutely no humanity, and they're gonna cut their ears off. They're gonna, torture them, put bags on their faces to choke them and torture them. And that's what Ruski Mir is all about. Imagine they're doing this on these suspects, right? We don't even know if they're actually the perpetrators. They're just suspects. Imagine what they've been doing in Ukraine for the last 25 months. And all the stories that we don't know of, all the stories of torture, rape, kidnapping, looting, beating, everything that the Russians have done in Ukraine is 1,000,000 times worse than this terrorist attack in Moscow. Again, I don't support terrorism. I never will. And I wouldn't wish it on anyone, even pro-Russians. But we need to really say things the way they are. Russia is a terrorist nation, and we need to call them out on this, and not, have a little mini violin for them or massive violin and everybody around the world getting together. Now we have the European Union talking about, we should work yet again with Russia and join forces to fight terrorism, right? Do you see how Putin has turned it over to make himself look more human, his regime look more human? Look, we're fighting now against terrorism. We have something in common that we can fight against. Yet you're the biggest terrorist of them all, right? You're terrorizing the entire world with your nukes. There's nothing worse than that. So we really need to call the Russians and continue calling them out for what they are. And their Ruski Mir, which is just a plague. And one last thing I want to mention is that Russia and the majority of Russian people, because now we're over 2 years of this war, there's been very little indication that the majority of Russians are willing to fight for the values that we believe in the West. So I think that the majority of Russians are simply sick and ill on imperialism. And the only remedy is the collapse of the regime and their state. That's the only remedy. Because the Russians are going to continue being fed this propaganda, being brainwashed into thinking that what they do is correct and normal. So these are my closing statements about the terrorist attack in Moscow. I'm not going to cover it anymore. I don't think it's worth it. And the Russians will continue spinning it for their own propaganda. But I think more and more that this was Russia getting caught with its pants down. Let me know what you think. Now, let's talk about also what happened this weekend, because the Russians yet again continued on terrorizing the Ukrainians by shooting more missiles at Ukrainian cities during the weekend. And I didn't mention it in my previous videos, but two, I think, or one of the missiles that were launched, the Kinzhals, actually flew through Polish airspace. And yet again, nothing happened. The Polish just let it pass for about 40 seconds until it went back into Ukrainian territory to hit Lviv, so the biggest westernmost city in Ukraine. And now we have an article, because that's not the first time this happens, and NATO just doesn't react whatsoever. Either they claim that there was no Russian missiles that flew through their airspace, or they said that, yeah, it did, but we didn't really want to respond, right? And here now, because of the, basically the outrage at the fact that NATO is just pretty much just standing idle, fully knowing that there's Russian missiles flying through their airspace and not acting on it, because of that backlash, NATO is now considering to shoot down Russian missiles near its borders. And I'm just confused, considering the very fact that they're already flying your airspace is a huge red flag, and it should be a no-brainer from day one that you should be shooting them down. That's not the first time this happens. And, to me, sometimes it can be so frustrating to watch Western leaders, especially in Europe, take so much time to make very evident decisions, right? The Russians are violating your airspace. God forbid this missile actually fails and falls in a Polish town or some other NATO country in some village and kills innocent people. You could have stopped that and prevented it, but you decided not to because it was the safe choice. It is clear that the Russians will continue doing this unless you stop it, unless you tell them, we're going to shoot down all of your missiles, and not only that, we're going to send even more to Ukraine. That's a strong response. That didn't happen. And now, these talks of considering, although it's positive, you should have done that as of day one without even considering. And let's also face it, Russia is flying these missiles and behaving like this because they feel like they're in their own backyard. After all, Putin, it's not the first time that they've done this, and there's been absolutely no repercussions to Russia. So they're having a field day treating Poland or the Baltics or Romania like it's their backyard. And the Russians are also utilizing this to avoid Ukrainian interception, right? Let's fly a little bit because they can also adjust course of the missiles. So let's fly a little bit in Poland because we know the Ukrainians can't shoot them down. And then boom, hits a Ukrainian city, right? You're also ensuring Ukrainian security, not only just your own. If you're claiming that you're there to protect Ukraine and help Ukraine as much as you can, then do so. And as I've said, the lack of this strong response has only helped Putin feel more confident with pushing his luck. So is Europe really waiting for a Pearl Harbor scenario where dozens, if not hundreds of people die following a Russian missile attack to then realize, that they should actually be doing something against Russia and being more strong in their response? We'll see. But this is very, very worrisome and concerning that NATO simply is just slacking behind all the time. It's like a snail in terms of decision making. And I understand that Russia is nuclear power. I understand that you need to take decisions very carefully. It's not saying you need to just work or make decisions based on emotions. That's not right. But I think that you need to be very you need to have a strong response, and that needs to be timely, not something that is 25 months later only to realize, now we should be considering this because, that's a real problem. What if, So I hope that there's not going to be, a Pearl Harbor scenario somewhere in Europe in a NATO country for them to realize that action should have been taken much earlier before. So let me know what you guys think about this consideration from NATO. Now, the last thing I want to mention, just a little update. So I talked about it on Sunday about the Ukrainians hitting several Russian landing ships, and it's confirmed now that the third one that I mentioned was rumored to be damaged is indeed damaged. So that is the Ivan Kurs. And there's also a fourth one that was damaged, which is the Konstantin Olshansky. So this is actually a Ukrainian landing ship that was seized by Russia during its annexation of Crimea in 2014. And so all the satellite imagery is pretty much confirming that all of them were damaged, all these landing ships. And knowing that the Russian Navy or defense industry is just terrible in repairing ships on a timely manner and repairing them properly, it's probably not going to happen in the near future that the Russians will be able to repair any of these ships. So it's evident, as I've said, the goal for Ukraine, if we're looking at the map, is to remove as many transport options for the Russians as possible once they destroyed the Kerch Bridge. The Kerch Bridge is a legitimate target for the Ukrainians this year. It's a target that needs to be destroyed. It's a critical lifeline for the Russians in Crimea. If they lose this, it's not like it's completely game over for the Russians in Crimea, but it makes it extremely, extremely, extremely difficult for them to resupply and move goods to Crimea and support the lifestyle that the Russians are so well used to in Crimea. Losing this is going to be a blow for Putin's reputation as well. Now, the Forbes article, I think, came out a day or two ago, mentions that the Russians have been preparing, with knowing that this scenario can happen. So they have rebuilt the railway connection between Crimea to Rostov. And that is a connection that I told you guys about. And this explains as well why the Russians in the first few months of the war really tried to push towards Volnovakha, take Mariupol, because this is a vital connection and this necessary land bridge between Crimea and Rostov in Russia, in eastern Ukraine. Or Western Russia, if you look at it from their side, their perspective. So the Russians have restored this railway connection between Rostov all the way up to Crimea. So indeed, they do have an alternative route that they can fall on. But this is a very dangerous one, because let's look at the distance between the Ukrainian-held territory. Let's say if we're looking at Orikhiv, let's measure the distance just grossly from Orikhiv all the way up to Tokmak. It's 36 kilometers, 40 kilometers. So that is well within HIMARS range already. And, it's pretty easy to intercept a very large railway car full of wagons. So the Ukrainians pretty much have complete fire control over this railway line. Not saying that it's going to be accurate or always accurate, but the odds are much better than the Kerch Bridge, where the Russians are absolutely 100% confident at moving supplies and not being hit. And railway is the most important for the Russians. Yes, there's landing ships. Yes, there's also cargo planes, but they won't be able to carry and transport as much fuel, ammunition, men, armored vehicles as trains will. And that's why the Russians are completely betting like 95% of their transport is based on railway. It's critical for them. So this is a dangerous road for the Russians. And then the last resort is, of course, trucks, but trucks takes an immense amount of fuel, time, and the roads are just not good in Ukraine, unfortunately, or I should say fortunately in this case. So for them, this is kind of the last resort option if the Kerch Bridge falls and they still need to resupply their forces in Kherson, in the south, in Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk. So that's the situation. That's why the Ukrainians are creating the shaping operation on destroying the landing ships, destroying air defense systems in Crimea, and freely move around and operate in the Black Sea to be able to control the Black Sea, and then eventually destroy the Kerch Bridge with most likely a combination of unmanned sea vessels that can pretty much enter Kerch, and also missiles, long-range missiles that Ukraine will certainly receive in the next few months. So let's count on that for this to happen. Otherwise, the situation in the map remains unchanged since my last update. Heavy fighting continues. Let's not get distracted. The Russians will continue pushing and trying to push as much as they can in the administrative borders of Luhansk and Donetsk. So this is their main goal. They're also trying to push a little bit towards the Orikhiv direction to push and drive out the Ukrainians out of Robotin, this small little village that they captured during the summer counteroffensive. But overall, we can see that in terms of the changes, we can look at the Russians essentially just really struggling to advance quickly, and they won't be able to. I think this is the pace that we need to be expecting, but I think that there is a lot of positive stuff as well for Ukraine. The Czech Republic, their initiative has worked. They have already provided Ukraine with 300,000 shells, which is a huge, important, big deal. And I'm starting to see more videos of the Ukrainians utilizing artillery again on the Russians. The last few weeks, it's been almost exclusively FPV drones. So we're feeling this drought of artillery shells, but now we see the Ukrainians start utilizing more and more artillery, which is a very positive sign. So I think that the Ukrainians now until summer will try to stabilize the borders, the front lines, I should say, so they can eventually shape an offensive perhaps in 2025. But this is very positive because the Ukrainians are receiving more support now with the Czech initiative of 800,000 shells. So the next batch will probably come in the next few weeks. And now they're claiming, Czechia is claiming that now they are ready to invest for 1.5 million shells so that they can find actually 1.5 million shells more of them around the world. So this is a very positive thing. And I thank you to Czechia. Honestly, such a small country, but such a huge difference because their leader, who was, I believe, and the older leader of NATO, so he knows what Russia is. He knows how they operate. He knows that the only way you can beat Russia is with weapons, right? So Czechia has made a huge difference for Ukraine. So huge thank you to you. I don't give enough credit to the Czech people. And unfortunately, right beside Czechia are two other countries that suffered under Soviet occupation, and yet now they have some of the most pro-Russian governments in Europe. That is Hungary and Slovakia. So they should add another clown face in Slovakia. But unfortunately, that's the situation. Very, very, perplexing as to why. But, they probably Putin has them somewhere under his payroll. And actually, I forgot to mention about Hungary, but today, I don't really know what the evidence is, but apparently Orban is under scrutiny, under a lot of backlash today because there was some evidence found that his government administration has been essentially conducting corruption or had corruption inside of their administration. So I don't really know the details. I didn't really read much about it, but are you surprised, right? There is no surprise whatsoever here. Especially seeing Orban's position in the last few weeks/months. So anyways, I digress on all these topics. You guys let me know what you think about the situation with Moscow, the terrorist attack. Do you still think that this was a false flag, or this was just a pure, the Russians got caught by surprise here, about the situation on the front line with the Ukrainians receiving more shells now and the shaping operation for the Kerch Bridge? I'm eager to hear your opinions, your thoughts. Write down in the comment section, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys in the next one. Slava Ukraini!